Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Dr. Dave Snow rejoins us to discuss how diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are fully infused into Canada's government and academic programs. Professor Snow is an associate professor at the University of Guelph and a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute think tank. Welcome back to Boom and Bust.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, so you did a study on DEI in federal granting programs. Tell us what you found.
Thanks. Yeah. So I did sort of a big deep dive first on what these three granting agencies, NSERC, the Science and Engineering Council, SHIRC, which is the Social Sciences and Humanities Council, and CIHR, which is the Health Council. They distribute most research funding dollars. And I look first and foremost at what they do, and then the extent to which EDI, as they call it, we call it EDI in Canada, or DEI, it's the same thing, has been integrated into these different agencies. And what I found is that while it's integrated to different degrees and different ways, that it's been infused into their work considerably, whether through specialized grants dedicated to DEI topics, whether through sort of guidelines that nudge researchers when they're applying for grants to include equity considerations and those sorts of things. And in certain cases, through what we might think of as affirmative action style policies designed to have more grants from underrepresented groups in amongst Canadian researchers.
So you declare that Canada's research funding has become politicized. So what do you mean by that?
Well, what I do in the report is I first identify that there's sort of three types of DEI or EDI that the agencies move between, and one is just broad commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion that in inoffensive language that we can sort of most of us can get on board with. Then there is the EDI of essentially affirmative action, and then finally what I call a more activist strand of EEI or DEI, which is what for lack of a better term, many people call critical social justice or woke. And that type of research is very politicized. It has a sort of explicit political agenda. Oftentimes, the research is framed in a way that you sort of know the answer to what you're going to find before you do it. And to me, that we can debate whether that's good research in and of itself, but it's certainly not what I think ought to be a top priority for granting agencies and sort of funding new research to develop new knowledge. And so what I've found is that especially at SHIRC, the Social Sciences Council, and especially at CIHR, the Health and Medical Research Granting Council, we're seeing more explicit activist
Mm.
language, both in terms of the guidelines and then at SHIRC, in terms of the actual grants that have been funded. We went through thousands of different grants. And even we're seeing an uptick in some EDI terms at NSERC, though it's less pronounced. So both in terms of the way that the granting councils frame what researchers should do, and then in the titles of the grants that are actually being funded, we're seeing more of this activist form of EDI over the recent couple of years.
So what you're saying is, as we go forward in time, there's a much more activist slant. Before, it was maybe more making sure there's a equitable distribution of grants, but now it's actual politicized or grants for political content in essence.
Yeah, and I'll give a couple examples. So these aren't, I guess, in terms of the major social science grants. I found, I analyzed over 2,600 titles. I categorized them according to, do they have sort of EDI language, and I found about 10 to 15% of the big grants have sort of explicitly activist EDI language in their titles. And to me, that's too much, but it doesn't suggest that those major grants have been completely overtaken by
Mm.
EDI. But there are certain grants that the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council has created over the last few years, one in particular called the Race, Gender, and Diversity Initiative. The very language it frames, if I'm a researcher and I'm applying for a grant, it's infused with the activist EDI language. It looks like a different type of grant than the rest of the grants on the website. And I'll just quote from a couple of examples. This is from the website. If I'm a researcher, I'm looking to apply for a grant.
Right.
And it asks which mechanisms perpetuate white privilege and how can such privilege be challenged. That sort of language assumes the answer to the research question. And we're seeing a lot more of that both in the framing and the grants themselves.
Interesting. We're having a conversation with Dr. Dave Snow. He is a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute, also a professor at the University of Guelph, talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, grants in our government funded system. We'll be back after these messages. Please stay with us.